Burmese pythons have devastated native wildlife in the Everglades.
A wildlife biologist working a tracking grid deep inside the Florida Everglades located a 4.5-meter Burmese python she had been monitoring for 11 weeks. The telemetry signal indicated a stationary 40-kilogram apex predator digesting a heavy meal, resting exactly where the data said it would be. She pushed through the final wall of sawgrass and found the massive animal with every scale intact, every heavy-muscled section perfectly undisturbed, except for one impossible detail. The head was gone, not damaged, not scavenged, cleanly missing. There were no drag marks in the mud, no blood trails, and absolutely no sign of the violent struggle required to overpower an untouchable invasive force. For 4 decades, the Burmese python has operated as an invincible juggernaut, systematically dismantling a $31 billion ecosystem while human eradication efforts completely failed. But this silent crime scene proves something in the swamp is finally fighting back. We are going to pull apart a terrifying, multi-layered biological mystery unfolding in real time to discover what is truly hunting the hunters. The official scientific record states that nothing in the North American wetlands possesses the physical capability to effortlessly decapitate a fully grown python. Yet, the biologist stood over a carcass that defied the natural laws of the Everglades, completely unaware that this brutal, unexplainable kill was only the first symptom of a much larger, invisible collapse quietly spreading through the mud. To understand the gravity of a single decapitated snake, you must first look at the brutal, documented mathematics of the python's reign. The official story of the Everglades over the last 40 years is a narrative of human failure against superior biology. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, alongside leading university ecologists, tracked and measured this invasion with absolute precision. Florida responded to the threat with everything in its modern arsenal. They deployed thermal tracking drones, hired professional year-round eradication squads, launched competitive removal events, and invested heavily in specialized mechanical traps. The institutional response was scientifically rigorous, deeply funded, and executed by experts. It was also entirely useless. A landmark ecological study quantified the precise devastation of the native food web, proving the human effort was failing to make a dent. Raccoon populations in the hardest-hit zones crashed by 99%. Opossums fell by 98%. Bobcats dropped by 87%. Foxes and marsh rabbits were functionally erased. Because a single female python can produce up to 100 eggs per clutch, the population simply absorbed every human removal event within a single reproductive cycle. The invasive predators hollowed out the mammalian food web, turning a thriving wetland into a silent green desert. The scientific consensus was absolute, backed by decades of peer-reviewed trapping data. The Everglades was permanently lost to a predator we could not stop. Because what is happening to Burmese python populations right now is not a human victory, it is a biological trap. Then the pythons started getting harder to find. This was not a sign of progress, it was a sign of adaptation. The early removal campaigns generated headlines and removal tallies and genuine institutional momentum. The Florida Python Challenge alone pulled hundreds of animals from accessible marshland in its first years of operation. Eradication teams working year-round logged thousands of hours in the field. The numbers looked significant on paper. What they did not reflect was the spatial reality of the terrain those teams could not reach. The Everglades covers approximately 1.5 million acres. The accessible road margins, canal banks, and levee edges where the early removal numbers were built represent a fraction of that total landmass. The deeper interior, the wet prairies, the cypress domes, the sawgrass ridges standing chest-high in standing water, is effectively impassable on foot and invisible from the air. As removal pressure concentrated along accessible corridors, the surviving python population did what every successful apex predator does under pressure. It moved, not randomly, precisely, into the zones where human logistics collapsed entirely. Here is the devastating simplicity of that dynamic. Every python removed from a canal bank was replaced by the offspring of females who had already retreated into terrain where no removal team could follow. The eradication effort was not hunting the python population. It was harvesting the edge while the core reproduced in silence. By the early 2020s, thermal drone technology had advanced enough to scan large areas of the interior. The results were not encouraging. Detection rates in deep cover terrain remained negligible. The animals were not hiding in any behavioral sense. They were simply operating in an environment that rendered every human tool statistically irrelevant against a population of their scale and distribution. Florida had built the most sophisticated invasive species removal program in North American history. The pythons had relocated beyond its reach. And while the last of the removal teams worked the accessible margins, something microscopic was already moving through the flooded interior those teams would never reach. And while all of that was developing above ground, something else was moving in the mud. The first indication was not a dramatic discovery. It was a pattern of absence. Field researchers working in python-dense zones began logging an anomaly in their native snake encounter data. The animals they did find were wrong, not injured, not predated, simply wasting. Emaciated specimens with clear eyes and intact scales moving sluggishly through habitat they should have owned, their bodies consuming themselves from the inside without any visible external cause. Dr. Christina Romagosa, a research scientist at the University of Florida, began systematically collecting and necropsying these animals. What she found inside their lung tissue stopped the investigation cold. The parasite was Rayleigh orientalis, an Asian lungworm, native to Southeast Asia, native, specifically, to the same geographic range as the Burmese python. It had arrived in Florida coiled invisibly inside its original host, completely undetectable during the decades of focus on the python's physical devastation above the waterline. By the time Romagosa's research mapped the full scope of the infection, the lungworm had established itself in at least 18 different native snake species across Florida. Florida cottonmouths, pygmy rattlesnakes, corn snakes, scarlet kingsnakes. The parasite had crossed species barriers with a biological efficiency that no eradication program had anticipated and no containment protocol had been designed to address. Here is the devastating simplicity of what that means. Remove every single Burmese python from the Everglades tomorrow. Eliminate the entire invasive population overnight. The lungworm does not care. It has already evolved a transmission pathway that moves directly between native snake populations through intermediate hosts in the soil and water. The python was the delivery mechanism. It is no longer necessary. The parasite is self-sustaining, permanently embedded in a food web that has no evolutionary immunity against it. The pythons brought a plague, and then the plague learned to live without the pythons. Where are you watching this from, and what invasive species is quietly altering your local ecosystem right now? Drop your geographic location and your answer in the comments below. Now back to the data, because what comes next is even more disturbing. But inside that same research effort, something appeared that nobody expected. Romagosa's necropsy data was building a picture of systematic collapse, species after species testing positive, infection rates climbing across the surveyed range. The lungworm was moving through the native snake community with the indifference of a biological process that had found a permanently hospitable environment. Researchers were not looking for exceptions. The data had given them no reason to expect any. Then the Florida cottonmouth kept testing clean. Not occasionally, not in isolated specimens pulled from the peripheral edges of the infected zone. Cottonmouths collected from inside the densest areas of confirmed lungworm activity were returning negative results with a consistency that the research team could not initially explain. The Agkistrodon piscivorus is not a peripheral species in this ecosystem. It is one of the most habitat-representative snakes in the Everglades, occupying the exact waterways and flooded margins where lungworm transmission rates were highest. By every environmental measure, it should have been among the most heavily infected animals in the survey. It was functionally untouched. Here is the devastating simplicity of why that matters. The lungworm does not distinguish between species by accident. It spreads through intermediate hosts, small invertebrates living in the same water and soil every native snake inhabits. The cottonmouth is drinking from the same infected system, moving through the same contaminated substrate, consuming prey from the same compromised food web as every other species registering positive results. Something inside its biology is rejecting the parasite at a stage researchers have not yet been able to isolate. The leading hypothesis involves the cottonmouth's unique venom chemistry interacting with larval stages of the parasite before systemic infection can establish. That hypothesis remains unconfirmed. What is confirmed is that one native species has cracked a biological code that is actively killing 18 others, and scientists are working urgently to understand the mechanism before the window to apply that knowledge closes permanently. They were still working on the answer when the cameras in North Florida captured something that changed the entire equation. And while they were still working toward that answer, something was happening in North Florida that nobody in the lungworm research had been told about yet. The eastern indigo snake is the longest native snake in North America. A fully grown adult reaches 2.6 meters, moves through its territory with absolute authority, and eats other snakes, including venomous species, without hesitation or physiological consequence. It is immune to the venom of every pit viper in its range. For the Burmese python, it represents something the invasive predator has never meaningfully encountered in Florida, a native apex competitor that hunts by the same rules and operates at the same scale. Conservation biologists had identified the eastern indigo as the theoretical keystone predator capable of confronting the python on biological terms. There was only one problem. By the early 1970s, the eastern indigo had vanished from North Florida entirely. Habitat destruction, road mortality, and illegal collection had driven the population below functional viability. For 50 years, the native king of the Florida food web existed only in captive breeding facilities and the institutional memory of herpetologists old enough to have seen one in the wild. Then, in late 2023, Dr. Kevin Njie with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission reviewed trail camera footage from a monitoring site in North Florida. The camera had captured 2 eastern indigo hatchlings, wild-born, alive, moving through native habitat on their own. Here is the devastating simplicity of what those 2 small animals represent. A hatchling eastern indigo does not appear in the wild unless a breeding pair has successfully nested and produced a clutch in that location. The footage was not evidence of a released animal. It was evidence of reproduction. It was evidence that the species had quietly re-established a self-sustaining wild population in North Florida for the first time in approximately 50 years. The conservation program had worked. The king was back, and its territory expansion moves in one direction. Tell us your location in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a locally extinct predator return to your region? Now back to the data, because what comes next is even more disturbing. But here is where the story turns dark in a way that cuts through any optimism. The eastern indigo snake eats snakes. That is not a peripheral detail. It is the central biological fact that makes everything that follows inevitable. The indigo does not hunt mammals. It does not hunt birds. Its diet is built almost exclusively around other reptiles, and its primary prey in Florida, the prey it has co-evolved with over millennia, is other snake species. As it moves south and its population density increases, it will consume the native snake species that are already carrying the lungworm. It will consume infected cottonmouths, infected corn snakes, infected pygmy rattlesnakes. Every prey animal it takes from a lungworm-saturated food web is a direct transmission event. The eastern indigo has no evolutionary history with Rayleigh orientalis. It did not co-evolve alongside the parasite in Southeast Asia. It carries none of the biological familiarity that might produce even partial resistance. It is, from the lungworm's perspective, a pristine, uncontaminated host of significant size moving deliberately into the center of an established infection zone. Here is the devastating simplicity of the collision these 2 storylines have been building toward. The 50-year conservation program that re-established the eastern indigo in North Florida did not save a predator capable of hunting pythons. It may have created a highly efficient biological pipeline that accelerates lungworm transmission into the one native apex species with the physical capability to confront the invasion. The king is not marching south to rescue the Everglades. It is marching south into an invisible wall of infection. It has no mechanism to survive. The lungworm's established range now covers significant portions of the indigo's southward expansion corridor. The leading edge of the recovering population is not approaching empty territory. It is approaching contaminated ground. Two separate forces, one a hard-won conservation miracle, one a self-sustaining biological catastrophe, are converging on the same ground at the same time. And neither of them knows the other exists. The swamp is not surrendering. What this investigation has uncovered is not a story about an invasive snake. It is a story about the shape of ecological collapse, how it moves in layers, how each layer conceals the next, and how every human intervention aimed at the visible problem accelerates the invisible one. We came to the Everglades looking for a predator. We found a system in the process of violently reorganizing itself around our mistake. If the lungworm has genuinely achieved permanent, self-sustaining transmission across 18 native species, then everything we thought we knew about invasive species management is wrong. We have been fighting the body. The infection was always somewhere else. The evidence is now on the table. A 40-kilogram apex predator found cleanly decapitated with no sign of struggle. Raccoon populations down 99%. Opossums down 98%. Bobcats down 87%. A Southeast Asian parasite spreading silently through species it was never supposed to reach. A venomous snake carrying an immunity no laboratory has yet explained. Two hatchlings on a trail camera proving a 50-year absence had ended. And a recovering apex predator walking south into a biological trap it cannot detect and has no history of surviving. Pause there. What we are witnessing in the Everglades is not an ecological disaster in progress. It is an ecological reckoning in progress. There is a difference. A disaster is something that happens to a system. A reckoning is what the system does in response. The Everglades has been responding for decades, in the dark, below the waterline, through mechanisms we were not equipped to observe because we were watching the wrong scale. The python was always a symptom of human carelessness. The lungworm is nature's response to that carelessness, and it does not share our timeline, our intentions, or our preference for clean outcomes. We do not get to choose how ecosystems correct themselves. We only get to watch, and to understand, and to sit with the weight of what our interventions have actually set in motion. We spent decades thinking the Burmese python was the apex threat in the Florida Everglades. We were wrong, but the Everglades isn't the only place where nature is silently rewriting the predator hierarchy beneath our feet. In New York City, rats have been disappearing from established territories at a rate that has no documented explanation, and the researchers who went looking for the cause found something already hunting them that the city has never officially acknowledged. Click the video on your screen right now to see what is moving through the infrastructure of the most surveilled city on Earth. Subscribe to Prime, Discoveristo, join the research collective, and we will see you in the next file. The swamp already knows what comes next. It has known for longer than we have been asking the question.